Thanks very much, Stuart. It's a pleasure to be here. It's great to see so many young folks interested in coming into our field, so I hope I don't blow it. I'd like to introduce my colleague, Don Beislein, who in 3 years has actually mastered not one, but two very challenging graduate programs at Stanford. He'll talk to you more about that later. So welcome to the farm. My job is to instruct you in ways to eliminate and clean your foes. No, that's the wrong farm, actually. I actually used that as a joke that nobody got, as an intro, because I think in oil and energy security, there are a lot of dimensions. I'm kind of known as a quant guy, but as you'll see, through working with Harry Rowan, emeritus in the business school, and Bill Peary, former Secretary of Defense in our department, I've actually tried to take a broad view on energy security and oil security. So I'm going to try in my 15 minutes to do three things. One is give you a quick review, most of you probably know this, on how big the global oil industry is. Number one. Two, a little bit of quant stuff, very basic kind of microeconomics applied to the world oil market. Talk about some stuff we did back in the 80s when oil security was a big issue. It's reemerged and been married into some of the sustainability issues more recently, and then really broaden the scope and talk about some ways we've tried to define, employ decision theory to marry very qualitative things like what is the intention of the leadership in Saudi Arabia, and is the US really prepared to fight two major confrontations on two fronts? I guess we have more information now about that than before. So the oil industry globally is very big. The world oil system involves shipping around and consuming 84 million barrels of oil per day. 84 million barrels. A barrel is 42 gallons. This is kind of a generic barrel. They don't actually have millions of barrels on oil tankers. And that amounts to about 1.29 trillion gallons per year, each and every year, or about 5.1 barrels or 215 gallons per every person who lives on Earth. Financially, this amounts to roughly 4% of GDP at the global level, but it's highly leveraged 4% that has pervasive influences all over because of the role of energy in general and oil in particular in the global economy, and also about 4% on the US side. So if you were to have, this is I think about an $80 oil price assumption for 2010, if you double the price of oil, you're going to, the first order effect's going to be, it's going to be 8% instead of 4% overnight. So this is probably the problem with oil. Moreover, the geopolitics are not good. There are major importing regions shown here in red on the positive side, the US, the EU, Japan, and increasingly China, and then exporting regions, mostly the Mid-East and other OPEC, think Northern Africa. So you have Libya and then the whole Persian Gulf region. So not some of our best friends historically, although there are some people with whom we still have good relations. I also have on the right-hand column kind of a notional, very notional reckoning of what it actually costs to lift oil in these regions. It's very low in the proliferous areas, Middle East and so on, and much higher, much more on the margin of the current oil price in the other regions. Here's a little picture from BP annual outlook, and I apologize for the faintness. Most of the reserves are also in these low-cost regions, so things will get worse before they get better. So think about China increasing demand a lot, and most of the marginal supplies coming from the Middle East, Persian Gulf type countries, or Libya, or wherever you want. So in terms of economics, I spent a lot of time on energy models. This was mentioned. You could kind of construct a supply and demand side view of the energy system and come up with a supply and demand for oil. The crosshatch is all the normal welfare economics in simplified form. I won't take time to do that. Some of you will know that instinctively. Others will have no idea anyway. So I'll just talk about this as being a representation of the supply and demand for oil in a particular country. For oil security analysis, it had proved useful to us back in the 80s to look at the import-export market, because that's where a lot of the action is on terms of oil price volatility and so on. The other thing that is distinctive is because of the long-lived capital on both the supply and the demand side of the oil industry, the short-run supply and demand curves are much steeper than the long run. So if you have a true surprise, something that you didn't anticipate, and I'll show you one graphic example, you could expect much more volatility on the price space just because these short-run supply functions are so steep. And there's ways around that, which I'll discuss. Here's my example. This is actually as the Iraqis left Kuwait at the end of the so-called Gulf War, not the Iraq War, the Gulf War, they actually thought it would be real cool to set all the oil fields on fire. So this was certainly something that was not anticipated, at least not to be done in that form. And there are actually lots of major environmental concerns regarding this piece of it. So we see in an oil price disruption a sudden reduction in supply that leads to a spike in price. So that's the nature of the economic side of it. If you want to talk about battleships and guns, you can do that. I was quoted in Stanford magazine as saying, when I first talked about oil security to David Stockman, who was the head of OMB under Ronald Reagan, he said, I shouldn't worry about all this economics crap and feedback, pardon my French, because if there was a problem, he would just send a carrier task force with lots of battleships into the Persian Gulf region. And I said, yes, sir, that is one thing you could do, but do you really want to put yourself in that position? One thing we thought of, which the clever economics idea that would never work, depending on how you feel about economists, we do a lot of this, would be to basically put on a tariff, to put on a tax on oil imports that was equivalent to the amount of the projected oil price spike, and then essentially get the revenues and keep them in the oil-consuming countries rather than shipping them over to oil producers. Unfortunately, if you think about how this would actually get done through our wonderful Congress, which is even more wonderful today, there's no way in hell that's going to happen. So the idea was good. Interestingly, at this point, our colleagues in Japan say, we'll just get on TV and tell people to cut back, and they'll just close that gap. As you see now, even in catastrophe right now, they're actually cutting back substantially on electric consumption through moral suasion, something that would not and probably will never work in the United States and most of Europe. So the thing I was pushing at this point with people like Bill Bradley and John Deutsch and Jimmy Carter, or whoever we could talk to, was the idea of having a big enough oil stockpile so you could hit the problem at the point of attack and just offset whatever was lost for a long period of time. And if you're an OR geek like I am, you could do multi-period Stackelberg game approaches and say, well, you have to save some because it could get worse in the next period. So that was our alternative to the disruption tariff, kind of hit the problem at the point of attack. I won't say a lot on this. One thing we learned when we looked at the actual record of the 73, 74, and 79, 81 Iran-Iraq war hostage situation, this is all before most of you were born, was the macroeconomics were really badly done, because in history, what had happened in a depression or recession when you had an economic downturn is you would basically interpret that as a demand insufficiency. So it was optimal to increase the demand side and push that back up, back towards the full employment level. Unfortunately, with a supply side shock, we had no experience with that. You actually saw something that led to hyperinflation. So we had, get this, 18% inflation rates on top of lower economic rates. So we actually made a bad problem worse through really lousy macroeconomic policies. This is what it says here. This actually happens in our modern economies because of rigid prices and wages. So what happens when the oil price goes up, it makes you consume less oil, it makes your other factors of production less productive, which means the returns to those factors, labor and capital, should go down. Well, you're already stuck with the existing capital, so you can't do that. You can't cut wages, usually because of collective bargaining agreements. One thing we tried to clarify, because there was a lot of confusion about this, is the difference between dependence on oil in terms of high import levels and vulnerability in terms of these economic outputs, with the stockpile idea being a perfect solution to the second one, but not the first. We did a lot of work on an oil import premium. What should the tax be on oil to internalize the externalities associated with it? We came up with two components. One is the less oil you consume, the lower the world price would be on average over a period of time. And also the less vulnerable you are, because you actually reduce the amount that you consume and the price spike that you get is smaller. That's actually shown on the following two charts, which I don't probably have time to go into. Now I'd like to talk about broadening the horizon here a little bit. So we were asked by the Strategic Petroleum Reserve Office to do a cumulative probability density function on the probability of oil disruptions of various sizes. So we were told not to do the policy, the stockpile bit for a little while. So we actually did a decision theory thing that had Saudis would be disrupted. We had assessments on political instability, internal and external, external attacks. And so Iraq could just keep going to Saudi Arabia and not stop at Kuwait and so forth. So we did this pretty very simplified version. Here's the more complicated one. There is this U.S. response capacity, U.S. Ability to respond. Interestingly, we had a sub-bullet in there as part of the assessment process with the political experts. Zalmay Khalilzad, now a famous name, was actually our expert in that area. We essentially put in a little bubble in this so-called influence diagram, which shows how the different assessments are related, that said the U.S. would be otherwise occupied, could be otherwise occupied with a conflict elsewhere in the world, and Saddam Hussein or some guy like that, Gaddafi, would venture back into oil-producing territory. We were pretty sheepish about that. We said, well, it's just paper study, analyst thing. So we actually worked about 12 hours that day. We got it in, and we said, what the heck, we're going to go for it. Turned on the news that night, and President Bill Clinton got on and said, I want to assure Saddam Hussein that the U.S. is not otherwise occupied within the burgeoning crisis in North Korea. I did this story for Bill Perry's class, and he came up afterwards and said, the reason Bill Clinton said that and said exactly those words is I gave him the text and told him, get your butt on TV and say exactly those words. So it actually turned out to be more real than we anticipated. Interestingly, if you're into CDFs, we were much more pessimistic than the CIA, who I referred to earlier, and thought there was a much bigger probability of an oil disruption at any size. DOE kind of followed on CIA studies. What they did is they just did historical frequencies. And we said, well, the structure of the world oil market has changed. We have this growing dependence on the more insecure reasons. This makes no sense at all. But they said, well, we're at the CIA, and we could tell you what we did, but then we'd have to shoot you. So the Spro office knew this would all work out this way. So it's not a big surprise. So then we were told not to do the stockpile stuff because it was too close to policy and their office couldn't do it. So a group at Oak Ridge that we were tied into did the stockpile assessment. So we did this kind of, you fill up, what I mentioned before, you kind of fill up, you save some for further contingencies and so on. That had, based on the previous economics, both a wealth transfer component and a disequilibrium macro component, which that's something that Hill Huntington, my colleague at the Energy Modeling Forum, has kind of updated those numbers. So we still have an oil import premium that's probably $15 to $25 a barrel on a base now of about 80. It could be a little bit higher now depending on how alarmist you are about world events. Interestingly, again, the President Bush, by this point, was considering whether to fill the Strategic Petroleum Reserve from about 600 million barrels up to 750. And as you can see here, this is kind of the target size and the net present value. In other words, the benefits minus the cost all discounted back. And we had kind of an optimal well over $1 billion. I did congressional testimony that said under certain circumstances I could see 1.5 to 2 billion barrels being the optimal. Of course, the press is always basically said that was my baseline recommendation. It didn't say that I could justify that number as part of a contingency plan, which is another whole problem. Again, we're way higher than the CIA, which we found kind of curious, and I already gave you the reason for that. Oops, went the wrong way. So then I've already talked about Saudi factors and diplomacy, and I used to call this I'm going to Saudi Arabia in a couple of weeks, so let's see, the pulse rate of the king of Saudi Arabia being equally as important as oil market fundamentals. So we tried to, in this decision analysis, I didn't go through all the details, kind of incorporate that, but here's, this is close to I think I have 2 more slides. So questions I leave people with are, can other energy policies help reduce oil dependence and vulnerability? I'll talk about some on the next page. Obviously, I really made the case for my own personal initial favorite, which was oil stockpiles, because you could build them up quickly and solve the short-term problem. There are longer-term things I'll talk about in a second. Do oil policies help with international security? If we didn't, I think there's a range of opinions on that, but no one would say we're totally independent of oil dependence and doing national security. We work a lot now with George Shultz, who tells this story that he was asked by 4 different presidents to look into oil security, and then 5 years later told to bug off because it was no longer a problem. And he said, well, I may be slow, but I think I've learned something from that. And of course, he was way ahead of me in observing that. Maybe Harry was close, Harry Rowan. The most haunting question to me here, which I did to the Perry class for a few years, was does or should international security have an oil policy dimension, both dependence and vulnerability? And what Bill Perry stood up and said at the end of these talks was, there's a lot less of this kind of thinking going on than you might think, which I found scary. So finally, back to the energy subject. You could do oil vulnerability things. I kind of already talked about them. One idea I had that Lynn and Sally would make fun of me is that you could just boost the flow rate from all the wells in the world, and that would fix the problem. Unfortunately, it would destroy about half of the wells out there, so that's not too good. On oil dependence, you could do an oil import free, which is why we did the premium calculations. You could do a lot of energy efficiency and substitution things, but I like to leave it with what we're very good at Stanford here now, and that is the last one, advanced energy technology development. So over time, you could develop substitutes for oil that could be useful. So dependence and vulnerability are somewhat separate. Vulnerability is first and foremost a short-term issue, but over time, if you reduce dependence down enough, you would have both a lower baseline to spread the cost increase over and a lower cost increase as a result of any contingency. So at that point, I'd like to turn it over to John. He'll clarify all the misinformation that I've communicated to you.